The vault beneath the Louvre. The clay is cold, heavier than you'd expect. The curator's white gloves cradle it carefully, rotating the cylinder so the incised wedges catch the vault's fluorescent light at just the right angle. Cuneiform. Thousands of characters pressed into wet clay over 4,000 years ago, baked hard by the Mesopotamian sun, and now resting in a climate-controlled basement beneath one of the world's most famous museums. This is Cylinder A. Its twin, Cylinder B, sits in an adjacent case. Together they contain roughly 1,400 lines of Sumerian text. They were discovered in 1877 at the ancient site of Tello in southern Iraq, and they've been puzzling scholars ever since. The text describes a dream, a vision really. A man named Gudea, who ruled the city-state of Lagash around 2120 BC, claims he was visited in sleep by the god Ningirsu. In this vision, Ningirsu gave him detailed architectural plans for a temple, not vague inspiration, precise measurements, material specifications, step-by-step construction rituals, ceremonies to be performed at each stage of building, offerings required, words to be spoken at specific moments. What's unsettling isn't that an ancient king claimed divine instruction. That's common enough in the historical record. What's unsettling is how the text reads. It doesn't sound like poetry. It doesn't read like myth. It reads like a technical manual, a procedural document, instructions for something that was meant to be followed exactly. And buried within those instructions are descriptions of ceremonies, rituals performed not to worship the gods, but to accomplish something else, to transfer power, to activate, to consecrate, to bind, to substitute, to open pathways between the divine realm and the human world. The curators don't typically emphasize this aspect when they display the cylinders. The museum plaques focus on Gudea as a pious ruler, a builder of temples, a patron of the arts. But the tablets themselves describe something darker, more complex, ceremonies that required blood, substitution, human participation in processes the Sumerians described as necessary to maintain the presence of the Anunnaki, the gods who, according to these same texts, had once walked the earth and ruled directly. If you're listening to this late at night, or during a quiet moment in your day, take a second to comment where you're listening from and what time it is for you. There's something grounding about knowing others around the world are asking the same questions at the same moment. Because the question these cylinders raise is simple but profound, what if the ceremonies described in Sumerian texts weren't symbolic gestures of devotion but actual procedures? What if the Sumerians were recording not beliefs but operations? And what if the power they sought from the Anunnaki wasn't metaphorical favour, but something far more literal, something that required precise ritual execution to transfer, maintain and control? The tablets are silent on that point. They simply describe what was done. And what was done is far stranger than most people realise. When gods walked the earth, to understand what the Sumerians were doing in these ceremonies, you first need to understand who they believed they were doing it for. And more importantly, you need to understand that to the Sumerians themselves, these weren't beliefs in the way we use that word today. They were documented facts, historical records, accounts of a time before, when the order of the world was different. Sumer emerged in southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, sometime around 4500 BC. By 3500 BC, they had developed the world's first cities. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, Lagash. These weren't small settlements. They were urban centres with populations in the tens of thousands, supported by sophisticated irrigation agriculture, monumental architecture, and the world's first writing system. That last point is crucial. The Sumerians didn't gradually develop writing through centuries of slow cultural evolution, testing and refining systems until they arrived at something workable. Cuneiform appears suddenly, already functional, already capable of recording complex administrative data, historical events, religious texts, legal codes, mathematical calculations, and astronomical observations. The earliest tablets we have are accounting records from Uruk dating to roughly 3400 BCE, but the script is already systematic, already standardized. It's as if they sat down one day and said, here is how you encode language in marks pressed into clay. And then they did it. The Sumerians themselves had an explanation for this sudden flowering of civilization. They said it had been given to them, taught to them, by the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki appears thousands of times across Mesopotamian texts spanning 3 millennia. In Sumerian, it's written as Darnunakane, or sometimes simply Darnuna. The D prefix is the divine determinative. A marker indicating the word refers to a god or divine being. The term itself breaks down roughly as those of royal blood or princely offspring, though translations vary. What doesn't vary is the consistency of their portrayal. The Anunnaki are described as a group of deities, distinct from other categories of divine beings. There's debate among scholars about the exact boundaries of the category, but most texts treat the Anunnaki as the children of Anand and Ki the Earths, making them a divine council responsible for determining fates, making decisions and governing the cosmos. They meet, they deliberate, they assign tasks, they judge, they rule. In the earliest Sumerian texts, the Anunnaki are not distant, abstract forces. They are active participants in earthly affairs. They walk in gardens, they sit in assemblies, they give instructions to kings, they father children with human women, they require feeding, they assign specific cities to specific deities, each god residing in their temple, each temple functioning as the literal house of that god. The Sumerian king list, one of the most important historical documents from ancient Mesopotamia, divides history into 2 distinct eras, before the flood and after the flood. Before the flood, kingship descended from heaven to the city of Eridu, and rulers reigned for impossibly long periods, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, kingship descended again, this time to the city of Kish, and the reign lengths become shorter, more human, though still extraordinary by modern standards. Mainstream scholarship treats the pre-flood kings as mythological, the long reign lengths as symbolic or corrupted data. But the Sumerians themselves don't frame it that way. They list these kings alongside historically verified rulers in the same document, using the same format, with no textual distinction between the mythological and the historical. The king list treats them as continuous history, and throughout this history, one element remains constant: the involvement of the Anunnaki. Kingship isn't earned in these texts, it's granted. Specifically, it's granted by An and Enlil, the 2 most powerful gods in the Sumerian pantheon. Kings don't claim divine right metaphorically, they claim literal divine appointment. They describe meeting the gods, receiving instructions, being chosen for specific tasks, and in return, they're required to perform very specific duties. The primary duty is maintenance of the temple. Every major Sumerian city had a central temple complex, a ziggurat with surrounding buildings that served as the house of the city's patron deity. The king was responsible for building, maintaining, and supplying that temple, not as an act of devotion, though certainly that was part of it, but as a functional necessity, because according to the texts, the god lived there, actually resided there, and if the temple fell into disrepair, if the offerings stopped, if the rituals weren't performed correctly, the god would leave. And when a god left their city, that city was doomed. This pattern appears repeatedly in Sumerian literature. The Lament for Ur, a text describing the destruction of that city around 2000 BC, explicitly states that the gods abandoned their temples before the city fell. The goddess Ningal tried to plead with the divine council to spare Ur, but An and Enlil had made their decision. The gods left. Ur was destroyed. The Sumerians didn't interpret this as metaphor. They understood it as cause and effect. The presence of the gods in their temples wasn't symbolic of divine favour. It was the mechanism by which divine favour operated. The god was literally there, incarnate in their statue, residing in the inner sanctum, consuming offerings, listening to prayers, and extending their power over the city. Which raises an obvious question. If the Anunnaki were gods, in the way we typically understand that term, omnipotent, omnipresent, immaterial, why did they need temples? Why did they need statues? Why did they need feeding? Why did they need rituals performed at specific times with specific materials in specific ways? Why, in other words, did they need such precise ceremonial procedures to maintain their presence? The texts don't answer this directly. They simply describe what must be done. But threaded through those descriptions is a pattern. The Anunnaki are portrayed as powerful, yes. Knowledgeable, yes. Long-lived, yes. But they're also portrayed as operating within constraints. They can't be everywhere at once. They require physical vessels, statues, to manifest in temple spaces. They need offerings to sustain that manifestation. They need human intermediaries to perform the rituals that keep the channels open between their realm and ours. This is where the ceremonies come in. And this is where the Sumerian texts start describing things that don't quite fit the category of worship. Because what the text describes sounds less like devotion and more like technology. Not technology in our mechanical sense, but something analogous. Procedures that accomplish specific effects, rituals that transfer specific powers, ceremonies that require specific components and produce predictable results. The Sumerians had a word for these components of divine power, me, and according to the texts, the me weren't metaphors. They were real, transferable, and utterly necessary to maintain the order of civilization. The language of power. In 1835, a British army officer named Henry Rawlinson was stationed in Persia, tasked with training the Shah's army. While there, he became fascinated by a massive cliff face at Behistun, about 60 miles from the city of Kermanshah. Carved into the rock 300 feet above the ground was an enormous inscription accompanied by relief sculptures showing a king standing over bound prisoners. The inscription was written in 3 different scripts. One of them was Old Persian, which scholars had partially deciphered. The other 2 were unknown. Rawlinson spent years making copies of the inscription, dangerous work that required hanging off the cliff face on ropes. By 1847, he'd succeeded in translating the Old Persian text. It was a proclamation by Darius the Great, describing his conquests and legitimizing his rule. But more importantly, it was a key. The same text repeated in 3 languages, 1 known, 2 unknown. The second script turned out to be Elamite. The third was Akkadian, written in cuneiform, the same wedge-shaped script the Sumerians had invented 2,000 years before Darius. The decipherment of cuneiform was a collaborative effort spanning decades, involving scholars across Europe. By the 1850s, they could read Akkadian with reasonable confidence. And as they worked through the thousands of tablets flooding out of Iraq from archaeological excavations at Nineveh, Nimrud and Babylon, they began finding something unexpected. Many of the Akkadian texts contained entire sections in a different language, an older language, one that didn't belong to the Semitic language family like Akkadian did, a language isolate, unrelated to anything else known. The texts identified it as emi.ir, which the Akkadians translated as native tongue. We call it Sumerian. The process of translating Sumerian was complicated by the fact that it had been dead as a spoken language for nearly 2,000 years by the time the Akkadians were writing about it. Sumerian survived into the first millennium BC only as a scholarly and liturgical language, the ancient Mesopotamian equivalent of Latin in medieval Europe. Akkadian scribes learnt it in school, translated it, wrote dictionaries and grammar texts for it, and those tools, preserved in cuneiform libraries, allowed modern scholars to begin the work of translation. By the early 20th century, vast collections of Sumerian tablets had been excavated from sites across southern Iraq. The University of Pennsylvania had been digging at Nippur since 1889, eventually recovering more than 30,000 tablets from that site alone. Many were administrative, grain receipts, worker rosters, legal contracts, but thousands were literary, religious, and historical texts. And as those texts were translated, a portrait of Sumerian civilization emerged that was far more sophisticated than anyone had expected. These weren't primitive myths. They were detailed records, historical chronicles, legal codes, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, medical texts, and ritual procedures, especially ritual procedures. One category of tablet discovered at Nippur has the catalogue designation CBS, Catherine Babylonian Scholarship Collection. CBS A241, for example, is a Neo-Sumerian ritual tablet published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies. It contains detailed instructions for a specific ceremony, including the materials required, the words to be spoken, the timing of the ritual, and the expected outcome. It's written like a recipe. Step 1. Gather these materials. Step 2. Arrange them in this configuration. Step 3. Recite these words. Step 4. Perform these actions. If done correctly, this is what will happen. This procedural clarity appears throughout Sumerian ritual texts. They're not vague, they're not poetic, they're precise, almost technical, and they describe rituals performed not as general acts of worship, but as specific operations designed to accomplish specific effects. The question that began troubling some scholars was this: why would purely symbolic ceremonies require such precision? If you're performing a ritual that's meant to express devotion, the exact wording doesn't matter. The precise timing doesn't matter. Whether you use cedar or cypress, whether the offering table is 2 cubits or 3, whether the incantation has 17 words or 20, none of that matters if the ritual is symbolic, but it matters tremendously if the ritual is functional. And the Sumerian texts treat these procedures as if they're functional, as if they accomplish something real, as if there's a correct way and an incorrect way to do them, and the difference between those two approaches is the difference between success and failure. This is particularly apparent in texts dealing with the consecration of divine statues. The ritual is called Mespi in Akkadian, which translates as washing of the mouth. It's documented in tablets from the 1st millennium BC, though references to similar procedures appear in much earlier Sumerian texts. The Mespi ritual transforms a carved statue into a living god, not symbolically. The texts are clear on this. Before the ritual, the statue is just wood and metal and precious stones. After the ritual, it becomes the actual body of the deity. The god inhabits it, sees through its eyes, hears through its ears, consumes the offerings placed before it. The procedure to accomplish this transformation is elaborate. It takes 2 days. It involves multiple priests with different specializations. It requires the statue to be taken to the river and washed. Specific incantations must be recited at specific moments. The statue's mouth must be opened with ritual tools, the same tools used in the Egyptian opening of the mouth ceremony, suggesting either cultural transmission or parallel discovery of the same procedure. And the texts describe this process with the same matter-of-fact tone as a carpentry manual describes how to join 2 pieces of wood. There's no mystical ambiguity, the statue is inanimate, the ritual is performed, the statue becomes animate, cause and effect. Western scholars typically interpret this as religious belief. The Mesopotamians believed the ritual worked, even though objectively it didn't. The statue remained inanimate. The belief that it was inhabited by a god was a psychological projection, a cultural construct, a shared fiction that served social and political purposes. But that interpretation runs into a problem. The Sumerians and their successors maintained these rituals with absolute consistency for 3,000 years. Multiple civilizations, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, each with their own languages and political structures, each maintaining elaborate temple economies and specialized priesthoods, all performing essentially the same ceremonies with essentially the same procedures. That's a remarkable investment of resources over a remarkable span of time for something that, in the standard interpretation, accomplished nothing real. Unless it did accomplish something, not necessarily what the texts claim in literal terms, statues coming to life, gods incarnating in carved wood, but something, some effect that justified the continued investment, some result that made the precision necessary. The Sumerians had a concept for the mechanisms underlying these rituals. They called them ME. The ME are difficult to translate because they don't correspond to any modern concept. They're sometimes rendered as divine powers or divine attributes or divine decrees. The Oxford Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian literature describes them as the fundamental elements that made civilization possible. They're listed in various texts, and the lists vary, but they include things like kingship, priesthood, warfare, metalworking, writing, music, sexual intercourse, truth, falsehood, judgment, decision-making. These aren't abstract virtues. The texts treat them as transferable objects, things that can be possessed, stolen, given, or lost. The most detailed account of ME transfer appears in the text in Anunnaki, preserved in tablets from the Old Babylonian period, but describing events from the earlier Sumerian era. In the story, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to visit the god Enki, who dwells in the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm. Enki welcomes her to a feast. He becomes drunk, and while intoxicated, he gives Inanna over 100 men. The text lists them. Holy Inanna received heroism, power, wickedness, righteousness, the plundering of cities, making lamentations, rejoicing. She receives the crown, the throne, the shepherd's staff. She receives the art of metalworking, the art of writing, the art of music. She receives the power to destroy, the power to build, the power to judge. Enki hands them over. 14 toasts. 14 sets of me. Inanna loads them onto her boat of heaven and flees back to Uruk before Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done. When Enki wakes, he's horrified. He sends his messenger Isamud to retrieve the me, but Inanna refuses to return them. She successfully transports them to Uruk, and the text explicitly states that this is why Uruk became a great city, because Inanna brought the me there, because she possessed the fundamental powers necessary for civilization to flourish. The story is usually interpreted as a political myth, Uruk asserting its dominance over Eridu by claiming to possess divine powers that Eridu once held. But read literally, the text describes something different. It describes a transfer of functional capabilities, powers that can be possessed by one deity or another, powers that, once transferred, alter the potential of the location they're transferred to. This isn't metaphor in the text. Inanna doesn't receive inspiration or blessing. She receives specific me. She loads them onto a vehicle, she transports them physically, and once they arrive in Uruk, that city's status changes. The Gudea cylinders describe a similar dynamic. Ningirsu doesn't grant Gudea abstract favour, he grants him specific knowledge, architectural plans, construction techniques, ritual procedures, things that Gudea didn't possess before the dream and does possess after. Transferable information that allows Gudea to accomplish something, building the Eninu temple, that he couldn't accomplish without it. And the ceremonies described throughout Sumerian literature operate on this same principle. They're not petitions for divine goodwill, they're procedures for transferring, activating, maintaining, or manipulating specific powers. Powers that the Sumerians called ME. Powers that they claimed came from the Anunnaki. Powers that required precise ceremony to access. The ME, divine operating systems. The temple at Eridu is the oldest, or rather its ruins mark the oldest continuously occupied sacred site in Mesopotamia. Archaeological excavations in the 1940s revealed 18 successive temple buildings at the site, one built atop the ruins of another, stretching back to approximately 5000 BC. The earliest structure was a small rectangular building, barely 10 feet on a side, with an offering table and what appears to be a niche for a divine statue. By 4000 BC, the temple had grown substantially, but even at its smallest, the site was clearly sacred, clearly maintained, continuously rebuilt over thousands of years on the exact same spot. Eridu was the city of Enki, and according to Sumerian tradition, it was in Eridu that the Mi were first held. The Mi appear in dozens of Sumerian texts, but their most detailed description comes from Inanna and Enki, a composition preserved in tablets from the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Nippur collection, now available in translation through the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at Oxford. The text is usually dated to the Old Babylonian period, around 1900-1600 BC, though it describes events from earlier Sumerian tradition. The setup is straightforward. Inanna, the goddess of Uruk, decides to visit her grandfather Enki in Eridu. The text describes her journey, her arrival at the Abzu, Enki's temple home in the subterranean waters, and the feast Enki prepares for her. Enki and Inanna drink beer. Specifically, they drink a lot of beer, and as Enki becomes progressively intoxicated, he begins offering Inanna gifts, not physical objects, ME. The text lists them in groups. After the first toast, Holy Inanna received the office of High Priestess, the office of On Priest, the office of Ib Priest. After the second toast, she receives On Ship, Kingship. After the third, the noble enduring crown, the throne of kingship. By the 14th toast, Enki has given away over 100 Mi. The list includes heroism, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing, the art of metalworking, the art of leatherworking, the art of building, the art of basket weaving, wisdom, attention, sacred prostitution, the kissing of the phallus, the setting up of lamentations, the giving of counsel, decision-making, ascent from the underworld, descent to the underworld, warfare, triumph, divinity, silence, the troubled heart, judgment, and musical instruments of every type. It's a strange list. Some entries sound like abstract concepts, wisdom, judgment, enmity. Others sound like specific technologies, metalworking, basket weaving, building. Still others sound like social roles, kingship, priesthood, sacred prostitution, and some sound like very specific ritual actions, the kissing of the phallus, the setting up of lamentations. Scholars usually interpret the Mi as representing the totality of civilization, everything that makes organized society possible. But the text doesn't describe them that way. It describes them as discrete things, individual powers or capabilities that can be separated from one another, transferred and possessed. Inanna doesn't receive a general blessing from Enki. She receives specific Mi, and once she receives them, she acts immediately to secure them. She loads the Mi onto her boat of heaven and departs for Uruk. The text is explicit about this. The Mi are cargo. They're transported. They have a physical location, first in Eridu with Enki, then on the boat with Inanna, then in Uruk. When Enki wakes and realizes what he's done, he's panicked. He calls for his messenger Isimud and orders him to retrieve the Mi. Those Mi are mine. Inanna must not bring them to Uruk. Stop her. Isimud catches up with Inanna at the first stopping point on her journey. He demands the return of the Mi. Inanna refuses. Her pilot Ninjixida confronts Isimud, and Inanna escapes with the Mi intact. This repeats at each of the 7 stopping points between Eridu and Uruk. Each time Isimud catches up. Each time Inanna refuses. Each time she escapes. When she finally arrives in Uruk, the text describes a celebration. She unloads the Mi, she distributes them, and Uruk is transformed. The city now possesses what Eridu once held. This is where the standard scholarly interpretation, me as abstract cultural concepts, starts to strain, because the text treats the me as if losing them is catastrophic for Enki and gaining them is transformative for Uruk. It's not just a symbolic transfer of prestige. Something functional has moved from one location to another. What could that be? One possibility, and this is speculation, what if the me are best understood as knowledge? Not abstract wisdom, but specific procedural knowledge. How to perform certain rituals, how to work certain materials, how to organise certain social structures, how to access certain powers or capabilities that require specialised knowledge to access. In that reading, Enki giving the me to Inanna is Enki transferring procedural information, teaching her, and Inanna bringing the me to Uruk is Inanna bringing that knowledge to her city. Knowledge that allows Uruk's priests and craftsmen and rulers to do things they couldn't do before, to perform ceremonies that weren't possible before, to access powers, ME, that require correct procedure to activate. This interpretation has a parallel in the Gudea cylinders. When Ningirsu appears to Gudea in a dream, he doesn't just tell Gudea to build a temple, he shows him how. The goddess Nidaba appears with a tablet of lapis lazuli showing the temple plan. Another figure appears with a basket and mould symbolising the brick-making process. A third figure holds a stylus, indicating the importance of recording the instructions precisely. Gudea doesn't receive inspiration, he receives an instruction manual, and after waking, he admits he doesn't fully understand what he was shown. He needs help interpreting the vision, so he consults the goddess Nance, a deity associated with dream interpretation. She clarifies the symbols, explains what each element means, what Gudea must do. Only after receiving this interpretation does Gudea begin construction, and the text describes the construction process in extraordinary detail. The materials are gathered from distant lands, cedar from mountains, precious stones from faraway regions, gold and silver and copper. Each material is specified, each has a purpose, each must be obtained correctly, and interwoven with the construction are rituals, purifications, offerings, incantations, specific ceremonies performed at specific stages. The laying of the foundation is a ritual, the placement of the first brick is a ritual, the installation of the door is a ritual. Each step requires correct procedure. Why? If the temple is just a building, why does it matter if you recite specific words while laying the foundation? Why does it matter if you make offerings at precise moments? Why does it matter if you source your cedar from one mountain range versus another? It matters if the temple isn't just a building, if it's a functional structure designed to accomplish something specific. If it's meant to house a god, literally, physically house them, then perhaps the construction procedure matters, perhaps the materials matter, perhaps the rituals aren't symbolic flourishes, but necessary steps in creating a structure that can contain and channel divine presence. The Gudea cylinders describe the completed Ininu temple as radiant, as awesome, as making the whole land bow down. Ningirsu takes up residence in it. The text says he enters his house and sits on his throne. From there he makes decisions for Lagash. This language is consistent throughout Sumerian temple texts. The god isn't present in a general, omnipresent way. They're present specifically in their temple. And if the temple is destroyed or abandoned, they leave. They go somewhere else. They're no longer available to their city. The presence of the god in the temple is maintained through specific procedures, daily offerings of food and drink, the clothing and cleaning of the god's statue, the performance of rituals at appointed times. These aren't symbolic gestures. The text described them as maintenance, as requirements, as the work necessary to keep the god present. And the knowledge of how to perform these procedures correctly, the knowledge of which words to say, which materials to use, which timing to follow, that knowledge is itself a form of ME, a divine power, a capability that must be possessed to function. This creates an interesting dynamic. The gods grant humans the me necessary to build temples, perform rituals, and maintain divine presence. But the me are required to maintain the God's presence. It's a loop. The gods give humans the tools to keep the gods anchored in the human world. And if humans fail to use those tools correctly, the gods leave. Unless the relationship isn't quite that simple. Unless the Anunnaki aren't granting favours out of benevolence, but teaching procedures out of necessity. Because they need something from the arrangement too. What could gods need from humans? The texts are surprisingly direct about this. They need service. They need offerings. They need the rituals performed. And they need human rulers to organise and maintain the system. The Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text preserving older Sumerian traditions, describes the creation of humans explicitly in these terms. The gods were tired of doing agricultural labour themselves, so they created humans to do it for them, to grow food, to make offerings, to perform the work of maintaining temples and cities. Humans aren't created for humanity's benefit in this story. They're created for the gods' benefit, to serve a functional purpose in the divine economy. And if that's the case, then the transfer of the me from gods to humans isn't a gift. It's training. It's the gods teaching humans how to perform the work the gods need done, which means the ceremonies described in Sumerian texts aren't worship in the sense of honouring a superior. They're work in the sense of fulfilling a contract. A cosmic contract established at the creation of humanity, one that requires humans to perform specific rituals with specific procedures to maintain the presence of the Anunnaki on Earth. And if humans fail to perform those rituals correctly, the contract is broken, the gods leave, and civilizations fall. The mouth that opens heaven. The British Museum holds a collection of tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king who ruled in the 7th century BC. Among those tablets are ritual texts describing a ceremony called Mrs. P, which translates as washing of the mouth. Related to it is another ritual called PTP, meaning opening of the mouth. These ceremonies were performed when a new divine statue was completed. Before the rituals, the statue was just material, wood, metal, stone. After the rituals, the statue was alive, inhabited, the god resided in it. This wasn't metaphorical. The texts are explicit. The statue sees, hears, smells, tastes and breathes. It consumes the offerings placed before it. It responds to prayers. And if it's removed from the temple or destroyed, the god leaves. The MSP ritual is documented in multiple tablets, with slight variations depending on the city and time period, but the core elements remain consistent. The procedure takes 2 days. It involves a workshop phase and a river phase. Multiple priests participate, each with specialised roles. Specific materials are required, and specific incantations must be recited at specific moments. Day 1 begins in the workshop where the statue was crafted. The statue is surrounded by reed huts arranged to the east and west. Offerings are placed, dates, flour, honey, ghee, wine. The statue is oriented towards specific stars or planets, depending on which deity it represents. Then the purification begins. The Ipu priest, a specialist in ritual purification, washes the statue's mouth with water. He recites, "He who comes, his mouth is washed." The washing is repeated 3 times. Then additional purifications with tamarisk, cedar, cypress. Each plant has a specific purpose. Each purifies the statue of a different type of contamination. The text is clear about what's being removed. The statue retains traces of its creation, the hands that carved it, the tools that shaped it, the workshop where it was assembled. All of that must be removed. The statue must be purified of its earthly origin before it can become a vessel for divinity. Once purified, the statue's mouth is symbolically opened using ritual tools. This part of the ceremony parallels the Egyptian opening of the mouth ritual so closely that scholars believe there was cultural exchange between Mesopotamia and Egypt, though the exact nature of that exchange remains debated. In both traditions, specific tools, often including an adze or blade, are touched to the statue's mouth while recitations are made. The purpose is to activate the statue's senses. The mouth is opened so the god can eat and speak. The eyes are opened so the god can see. The ears are opened so the god can hear. After these openings, the statue is no longer inert. It's receptive, prepared, but not yet inhabited. Day 2 involves transporting the statue to the river. The river is crucial. In Mesopotamian cosmology, rivers connect the earthly realm with the Abzu, the subterranean freshwater realm where Enki dwells and where the sources of all life reside. The river is a threshold, a liminal space, neither fully earthly nor fully divine. At the riverbank, more offerings are made, more incantations recited. The statue is washed again, this time in the flowing water, and the texts describe this washing as transformative. The river removes the last traces of human creation. The statue is no longer the product of craftsmen. It's reborn from the water, from the Abzu, from the realm of the gods. After the river ceremony, the statue is brought to the temple. It's installed in the inner sanctum. The final incantations are recited, and the text states, "From this day forward, this statue is the god, not a representation of the god, not a symbol of the god, the god. The statue will be dressed daily, fed daily, cleaned and cared for as if it's a living being, because according to the ritual it is. The god inhabits it, resides in it, perceives through it. And if the ritual wasn't performed correctly, none of that happens. The statue remains wood and metal. The god doesn't come. The temple is empty." This raises an obvious problem for the symbolic interpretation. If the Mespi ritual is purely cultural, a shared fiction that the statue is alive even though objectively it isn't, why does it require such precision? Why specify exactly which type of wood must be used for purification? Why require the statue to face specific stars? Why does the timing of the ritual matter? Why must certain words be said at certain moments? Symbolic rituals don't typically require that level of procedural exactness. Devotional acts can be sincere without being precise. But the MSP texts read like technical manuals. They specify materials, timing, participants, words, and actions with the same level of detail a modern engineer would use to describe assembling a piece of equipment, which suggests the ritual was understood as functional, as accomplishing something that required correct procedure to accomplish. What could that something be? One possibility, the ritual creates conditions that allow a non-physical entity to interact with the physical world through a physical object. The statue becomes an interface, a terminal, a point of contact between realms that are normally separate. This interpretation isn't explicitly stated in the texts, but it's consistent with how the texts describe divine presence. The gods aren't omnipresent in Mesopotamian theology. They have specific locations. Enki is in the Abzu, An is in heaven, Enlil is in Nippur. When a god wants to act in a location where they're not physically present, they need a mechanism to extend their presence there. The statue, properly consecrated, provides that mechanism. It's not that the god's consciousness is limited to the statue. It's that the statue is a point where the god can focus their attention and exert their power, a terminal connected to a larger network. And if that's the case, then the Mespi ritual isn't creating life in the statue, it's opening a channel, establishing a connection, tuning the statue to the correct frequency so the god can use it. This would explain the emphasis on purification. If the statue is going to serve as a connection point between the divine realm and the earthly realm, it can't retain traces of purely earthly origin. It has to be purified, set apart, made receptive to the divine signal rather than earthly noise. It would explain the river ceremony. Water is a threshold, a boundary between states. Immersion in the river symbolically, or perhaps actually, removes the statue from one category of being and introduces it into another. And it would explain why the ritual must be performed by specialists who know the correct procedures. Because if you're establishing a connection between realms, And if that connection requires specific conditions to function, then the people performing the ritual need to know exactly what they're doing. They need to have been trained. They need to possess the procedural knowledge, the ME, required to open the channel successfully. This interpretation casts a different light on what's happening in Sumerian temples. The daily offerings aren't symbolic gestures of devotion, they're maintenance. The feeding and clothing of the statue aren't expressions of reverence, they're operational procedures, actions required to keep the channel open, to keep the god present and active in the temple. And if the procedures stop, the channel closes, the god withdraws, the city loses divine protection, and everything that depends on that protection, agriculture, military success, social order, begins to collapse. This would explain the Sumerian obsession with ritual correctness. It would explain why temple priesthoods were specialized, trained from childhood, and maintained at great expense. It would explain why rulers like Gudea devoted enormous resources to temple construction and ritual performance. Because if the rituals were functional, if they actually accomplished something necessary for the survival of the city, then getting them right wasn't a matter of piety. It was a matter of survival. And the question becomes, what were the Sumerians trying to survive? What threat required constant divine presence to hold at bay? The texts hint at an answer, but it's not the answer most modern readers expect. Dreams from Ningersu. In 2120 BC, a man named Gudea ruled the city-state of Lagash. He wasn't born into royalty. He was appointed by the previous ruler, Ur-Bao, possibly as a son-in-law. His legitimacy wasn't hereditary, it was contingent, and like all Sumerian rulers, his authority depended on maintaining the favour of the city's patron deity. For Lagash, that deity was Ningirsu, a warrior god associated with agriculture, thunderstorms and the plough. Ningirsu's temple in Lagash was called the Aninnu, the House of 50, though by Gudea's time the temple had fallen into disrepair. It needed rebuilding. But rebuilding a temple wasn't a simple construction project. It required divine approval, divine instruction, and divine resources. Gudea needed a sign. The Gudea cylinders, now in the Louvre, describe what happened next. The text is written in Sumerian, inscribed in thousands of cuneiform wedges across two large clay cylinders. Each cylinder is roughly a foot tall and 6 inches in diameter. Together, they contain approximately 4,300 lines of text, one of the longest continuous Sumerian compositions ever discovered. The text begins with Gudea's decision to rebuild the Aninnu, but he doesn't start by gathering materials or hiring craftsmen. He starts by seeking a dream oracle. He purifies himself, makes offerings, and lies down in the temple to wait for guidance. The dream comes. In the vision, a man appears. He's enormous, divine. The text describes him. His upper part reached to heaven, his lower part reached to earth. He wears the crown of a god. He's accompanied by a lion, and beneath his feet a storm rages. This is Ningirsu. Ningirsu speaks. He commands Gudea to build his house. But the command is only the beginning of the vision, because Ningirsu doesn't just say, "Build me a temple," he shows Gudea what to build. A goddess appears, Nidaba, the deity of writing and accounting. She holds a tablet of lapis lazuli with the plan of the temple inscribed on it. Another goddess appears, holding a silver stylus, indicating the stars. She shows Gudea the correct timing, when to begin construction, when to perform specific rituals, when to dedicate the completed temple. Another figure appears carrying a basket and a brick mould, representing the materials and techniques Gudea must use. Every element of the vision contains information, instructions. The dream isn't vague inspiration, it's a detailed blueprint. But when Gudea wakes, he's troubled. He doesn't fully understand what he was shown. The symbols are dense, layered. He needs interpretation. So he travels to the city of Nina to consult the goddess Nance, a deity associated with dream interpretation and prophecy. Nance clarifies the vision. The man was Ningirsu. The command was genuine. The tablet held the actual temple plan. The timing indicated by the stars is crucial, and Gudea must begin by gathering materials from across the known world: cedar from the Amanus Mountains, gold from Meluhar, copper from the Zagros, stone from distant quarries. Only after this interpretation does Gudea begin work. And the text describes the work in extraordinary detail. Cylinder A, which covers the preparation and early construction, reads like a logistical document. Materials are sourced. Workers are organised. Rituals are performed at each stage. The foundation is purified. The first brick is consecrated. Specific offerings are made before specific construction milestones. Cylinder B describes the completion of the temple and Ningirsu's entry into it. The text shifts from logistical to ceremonial. The Anunu is finished. It's radiant, awesome, worthy, and Ningirsu comes to inspect it. The description of Ningirsu entering his completed house is striking. The Lord entered his house. Ningirsu entered the Aninu. The house was perfected in joy. The house, its divine powers were perfected. In the Aninu, Ningirsu took his seat on his throne, and from that throne, the text says, Ningirsu makes decisions for Lagash, determines fates, grants prosperity. The city flourishes because the god is present, actively present, functioning through the temple that was built according to the precise specifications revealed in a dream. This is where things get interesting, because if we take the text at face value, what Gudea received in his dream wasn't abstract inspiration, it was information, specific, detailed, procedural information about how to construct a building that could serve a specific function, housing a god. The information came in symbolic form, visions, figures, objects representing concepts, but once interpreted, those symbols translated into actionable instructions, plans, materials, techniques, timing. This pattern appears throughout ancient texts. Divine knowledge is transmitted through dreams, visions, and direct encounters. But it's not transmitted as abstract wisdom, it's transmitted as procedural knowledge, instructions for building, instructions for ritual, instructions for organising society, instructions for maintaining the presence of the gods. Moses receives the tabernacle instructions on Mount Sinai, detailed architectural plans, material specifications, ritual procedures. Ezekiel receives a vision of the restored temple, measurements, dimensions, ceremonial regulations. Solomon builds the first temple according to a plan his father David received by the Spirit, meaning through divine revelation. The pattern is consistent across cultures and millennia. Sacred architecture isn't invented by humans, it's revealed by the divine, and the revelation includes precise specifications because the building is meant to accomplish something specific. For the Sumerians, that something was creating a dwelling place for the gods, a temple that could actually house an Anunnaki deity, a structure built according to divine specifications, because those specifications weren't arbitrary, they were necessary. The design, the materials, the construction rituals, all of it served a function, and that function was establishing a permanent connection point between the realm of the gods and the realm of humans. This interpretation helps make sense of something that otherwise seems bizarre: the Sumerian obsession with architectural precision in temple construction. Why does it matter if the ziggurat's base is a perfect square? Why does it matter if the walls are oriented to the cardinal directions? Why does it matter if specific types of wood are used for specific structural elements? It matters if the building's geometry and materials and construction procedure are part of what makes it functional. If the temple is a device, a technology for maintaining divine presence, then getting the specifications right is as important as getting the wiring right in an electrical system. Change the design too much and it doesn't work. The Gudea cylinders suggest that the Sumerians understood this. They didn't view temple construction as creative architecture, they viewed it as following a revealed pattern, a pattern that came from the gods themselves, a pattern that, if followed correctly, would create a structure the gods would inhabit. And when the gods inhabited those structures, something changed, not just religiously or psychologically, but practically. Cities with active temples prospered, cities whose temples fell into disrepair, or whose gods departed, collapsed. The correlation appears repeatedly in Sumerian texts. The presence of the god in the temple is directly linked to the prosperity of the city. The absence of the god is directly linked to destruction, which suggests the Sumerians weren't engaging in magical thinking. They were observing cause and effect. When the rituals were performed correctly and the god was present, the city functioned. When the rituals failed and the god left, the city fell. Unless there's another explanation, unless what the Sumerians interpreted as divine presence was something else. Some other factor, social cohesion, organised labour, elite legitimacy, that the temple system maintained, and that collapsed when the system broke down. That's the standard scholarly explanation. And it's not wrong. Temple economies did organise labour, priesthoods did legitimise rulers, ritual participation did create social cohesion, but that explanation doesn't account for the specificity of the procedures. It doesn't explain why symbolic rituals would require such exact technical details. It doesn't explain why different civilizations separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years would maintain essentially the same ritual procedures if those procedures were purely cultural constructs with no functional basis. Unless the procedures weren't purely cultural, unless they were preserving something, replicating something, maintaining something that earlier peoples had discovered worked, even if later peoples didn't fully understand why. The Gudea cylinders describe a transmission of knowledge from God to human, instructions for building something humans couldn't figure out on their own. And if that transmission actually happened, not necessarily in literal supernatural terms, but as the passing down of specialised knowledge from an earlier, more advanced source, then what the Sumerians were building might have been more sophisticated than we've assumed. Not temples as symbolic structures, but temples as functional devices, designed according to principles we no longer understand, maintained through procedures that sound like ritual, but might have been something closer to technology. Technology for keeping channels open between the human world and whatever realm the Anunnaki inhabited. And if those channels required specific ceremonies to maintain, ceremonies that the Sumerians recorded in painstaking detail across thousands of tablets, then understanding what those ceremonies actually were becomes crucial. Because some of them weren't just elaborate, some of them were dark, dangerous, costly in ways that go far beyond offerings of grain and incense. Some of them required blood. The Great Death Pit. In 1922, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley began excavating at the ancient Sumerian city in southern Iraq. The site had been identified decades earlier, but systematic excavation didn't begin until Woolley's joint British Museum and University of Pennsylvania expedition. Over 12 years, Woolley's team uncovered an astonishing wealth of material, temples, residential quarters, administrative buildings, and most famously, the Royal Cemetery. The cemetery contained approximately 1,850 burials spanning several centuries in the mid-3rd millennium BCC. Most were ordinary graves, simple pits with basic grave goods, pottery, tools, jewellery, but 16 burials were different. Woolley classified them as royal because of their structure and contents. These weren't simple pits. They were elaborate tombs consisting of a vaulted chamber accessed by a sloping ramp and connected to a larger open area. Woolley called these larger areas death pits. The most famous is PG 1237, known as the Great Death Pit. When Woolley excavated it in 1928, he found 74 bodies arranged in rows. 68 were women, 6 were men. All appeared to have died at the same moment. There was no evidence of violence, no trauma to the skeletons, no signs of struggle. The women wore elaborate headdresses of gold and lapis lazuli. They carried musical instruments, lyres decorated with bull heads crafted from gold and lapis. The positioning suggested they'd been part of a procession. They entered the pit, arranged themselves in rows, and died. Nearby, in the tomb chamber proper, archaeologists found the body of a woman identified tentatively as Queen Puabi based on a cylinder seal found with her remains. Her burial was even more elaborate than those in the death pit. Her body was adorned with a headdress of gold leaves and flowers, necklaces of gold and precious stones, finger rings, and other jewellery. Surrounding her were more bodies, attendants, guards, a sledge pulled by oxen with the bodies of the oxen and their handlers still in position. The scene suggested a procession. The queen was buried in her chamber. Her attendants, musicians, guards, and animals were led into the death pit. They arranged themselves. They drank or ate something. Analysis suggests poison, possibly opium dissolved in liquid, and then they died altogether to accompany their queen into the afterlife. This isn't speculation. The archaeological evidence is clear. These people were killed intentionally as part of a burial ritual. Human sacrifice. Mass human sacrifice. And it wasn't an isolated incident. Woolley found variations of this pattern in multiple royal tombs. Different numbers of victims, different arrangements, but the same basic structure. The royal burial accompanied by the ritual killing of attendants. The mainstream interpretation is straightforward. The Sumerians believed their kings and queens needed servants in the afterlife, so they sent servants with them. It's horrifying by modern standards, but it's consistent with burial practices in other early civilizations, Egypt, China, sub-Saharan Africa, where elite burials sometimes included sacrificed attendants. But there are problems with this interpretation in the Sumerian context. First, human sacrifice isn't common in Sumerian civilization. It appears at Ur during the early dynastic period, roughly 2600-2500 BC, and then vanishes. We don't find evidence of it before or after. It's a localized phenomenon, limited to a specific place and time. That's strange if it was a core religious belief. Core beliefs tend to persist. Second, the texts don't describe it. Sumerian literature is extensive. We have myths, hymns, lamentations, administrative records, legal codes, medical texts, mathematical tablets, thousands of documents describing Sumerian religious practice, but almost none of them mention human sacrifice at royal burials. The death pits are archaeologically real, but they're textually invisible. There's one exception. A Sumerian literary text called The Death of Gilgamesh describes the hero king's burial at Uruk. The text is fragmentary, but the surviving portions mention offerings made at Gilgamesh's death, including offerings of people, servants, guards, and possibly family members who were sent with him. The language is ambiguous, but it could describe sacrificial burial. If that interpretation is correct, it suggests the practice was rare enough to be noteworthy, significant enough to be recorded in a major literary composition, and specific to particular burials of extraordinary importance. But why? Why would the Sumerians, who didn't practice widespread human sacrifice, who left no ritual texts describing how to conduct such sacrifices, suddenly kill 74 people to bury with a queen? What purpose did it serve? The functional explanation is that they believed it served a purpose, that the attendants weren't just symbolically accompanying the ruler into the afterlife. They were functionally necessary for something the ruler needed to accomplish in that afterlife. Sumerian afterlife beliefs were bleak. The dead went to the underworld, called Kur or sometimes Ikala, a dark, dusty place ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal. It wasn't a place of reward or punishment. Everyone went there, kings and commoners alike, and existence there was dim, diminished, barely conscious, unless you were divine. The gods could move between the underworld and the upper world. They had access, agency, power in both realms. And Sumerian kings claimed divine ancestry or divine appointment. They weren't gods themselves, but they were intermediaries between gods and humans. They held emi granted by the gods. They performed rituals that maintained the presence of the gods in the temples. What if the death pit burials were part of that same system? What if the attendants weren't sent with the ruler for the ruler's benefit, but as part of a ritual designed to maintain the ruler's function even after death? This is speculation, but consider the pattern. The king or queen wasn't just a political leader. They were a ritual functionary, a living conduit between the human city and the divine realm. Their presence maintained cosmic order, and when they died, that conduit was severed, unless the ritual could preserve it. Unless the burial ceremony, performed with the correct procedures and the correct offerings, including human offerings, could transform the dead ruler into something that continued to function, not as a living person, but as a link, an anchor, a presence that kept the connection to the gods intact even after physical death. The death pit would then serve a specific purpose. The attendants weren't servants for the ruler's comfort. They were components of the ritual. Their deaths were sacrifices in the original sense of the word, something made sacred, set apart, offered to accomplish a divine purpose. This reading is consistent with other Sumerian ritual practices. The Ems-P ritual sacrifices animals to purify and consecrate a divine statue. The substitute king ritual, which we'll examine shortly, sacrifices a human to avert evil omens from the true king. Sacrifice in Mesopotamian religion isn't primarily about appeasing angry gods. It's about transformation, taking something from the profane realm and moving it into the sacred realm so it can accomplish sacred functions. If the death pit attendants were sacrifices in that sense, their deaths weren't murders, they were transformations. They were moved from ordinary human status into sacred status, and in that transformed state they served a function. They anchored the dead ruler's presence. They maintained the ritual connection between and its gods. They ensured that even though the king was dead, the king's function continued. This would explain why the practice was rare. It wasn't needed for every burial, only for burials of rulers whose deaths threatened the stability of the entire system. Rulers whose divine connections were so essential that losing them entirely would collapse the city's relationship with the Anunnaki. It would explain why the practice ended. If it was tied to a specific understanding of kingship, and if that understanding changed, if later Sumerians developed different rituals for maintaining divine presence that didn't require mass sacrifice, then the death pits would cease. The function would be accomplished through other means, and it would explain the textual silence. If the ritual was understood as necessary but horrifying, if it was performed only in extremity, if it was connected to esoteric knowledge held by specialized priesthoods, then it wouldn't be described in public texts. It would be restricted knowledge, performed when required, not discussed openly. But this raises a darker question. If the Sumerians believed that maintaining their connection to the Anunnaki required human sacrifice in certain circumstances, what else did it require? What other ceremonies, what other offerings, what other procedures did they perform that we don't have clear records of? Because those procedures were never meant to be public knowledge. The death pits give us a glimpse of ritual practices that the texts don't describe. They show us that Sumerian religion had dimensions that weren't recorded in hymns and prayers, dimensions that were acted out in burial chambers and sealed beneath the earth. And if human sacrifice was one of those dimensions, carefully controlled, rarely performed, but understood as necessary when the situation demanded it, then what else was happening in the inner sanctums of Sumerian temples that never made it into the official record? What other ceremonies were performed to maintain the presence of the Anunnaki? And what price did those ceremonies demand? The sacred marriage, power through union. The temple of Inanna at Uruk was called the Ianna, the house of heaven. It was one of the oldest and most important temples in Sumer, continuously occupied from the Uruk period around 4000 BC through the end of Mesopotamian civilization. The temple complex was enormous, consisting of multiple buildings, courtyards, storerooms, and administrative offices. At its centre was the Gipar, the residence of the high priestess, and it was in the Gipar that one of the most important rituals in Sumerian religion was performed, the sacred marriage. The sacred marriage, called hieros gamos in Greek, was a ritual union between the goddess Inanna and a human representative, typically the king. The ceremony is documented in multiple Sumerian hymns and ritual texts dating from the early 3rd millennium BC through the Neo-Sumerian period around 2000 BC. One of the most explicit descriptions comes from a text called The Courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi, preserved in tablets from Nippur. Dumuzi is described in Sumerian tradition as a king of Uruk in the early dynastic period, though he's also depicted as a shepherd god and the divine consort of Inanna. The text describes their courtship, their marriage, and the ritual union that consecrates Dumuzi as king. The language is erotic, explicitly so. Inanna speaks, "My vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven, is full of eagerness like the young moon. My untilled land lies fallow. As for me, Inanna, who will plough my vulva? Who will plough my high field? Who will plough my wet ground?" Dumuzi answers, "Great lady, the king will plough your vulva. I, Dumuzi the king, will plough your vulva." And Inanna responds, "Then plough my vulva, man of my heart." Plough my vulva, this isn't poetic metaphor veiling something else. The language is literal. The ritual involves sexual intercourse between the high priestess, representing Inanna, and the king, representing Dumuzi. The union is performed in the Gipar, the sacred chamber of the temple, on the night of the New Year festival. And the purpose of the union isn't procreation or even symbolic fertility, though fertility is part of it. The purpose is power transfer, legitimization. The king's authority doesn't come from heredity or conquest. It comes from the goddess, and the goddess grants it through the sacred marriage. Another text, the Blessing of Inanna, describes what happens after the union. Inanna has granted him the staff and crook of shepherdship. She has spoken of him favourably to An and Enlil. She has made his throne firm. She has granted him a good reign. She has given him the power of kingship. The sacred marriage isn't a wedding in the romantic sense. It's an investiture ceremony, a coronation. The king receives authority through physical union with the goddess, or more precisely, with the priestess who embodies the goddess during the ritual. The act of union transfers the emi of kingship from the divine realm to the human king, and once transferred, those emi grant him the power to rule. This raises an obvious question. Did the Sumerians actually believe the priestess became Inanna during the ritual? Did they think the goddess literally entered her body, or was the priestess playing a symbolic role? The texts are ambiguous on this point, but the ritual is treated as genuinely transformative, not merely symbolic. After the sacred marriage, the king has authority he didn't have before, and that authority is recognized by the priests, the nobility, and the common people. Something real has changed. One possibility is that the ritual functioned as a form of collective belief. Everyone agreed that the ceremony transferred power, so for all practical purposes, it did. The king's legitimacy was based on communal acceptance, and the ritual provided a moment where that acceptance was formalized and sacralized. But there's another possibility. What if the ceremony was understood as an actual power transfer, not symbolic but functional? What if the physical union between priestess and king created conditions that allowed the goddess to extend her authority to him? In that reading, the priestess isn't pretending to be Inanna, she's serving as a conduit. During the ritual, performed at the correct time, in the correct space, with the correct words and actions, a channel opens. Inanna's presence flows through the priestess. The king unites with that presence, and through the union he receives the emi, the divine powers necessary to function as king. This interpretation is consistent with how other Sumerian rituals function. The Mespi ritual doesn't make people believe the statue is a god. It makes the statue into a vessel the god can inhabit. The temple doesn't symbolize the house of the god. It is the house of the god, designed to specifications that make divine habitation possible. If the sacred marriage operates on the same principle, then the ritual isn't about belief. It's about creating conditions that allow a transfer to happen. The priestess's body becomes a temporary vessel. The king unites with that vessel, and through the union, the goddess's power is transmitted to him. This would explain why the ritual had to be performed by the high priestess specifically, not just any priestess. She wasn't an actress playing a role. She was a trained specialist who knew how to make herself receptive to divine presence. She'd been prepared from childhood, educated in the mysteries of the temple, initiated into procedures that most people never learn. It would explain why the timing mattered. The New Year festival, when the sacred marriage was performed, marked a cosmic reset. The old year ended. The new year began. Order had to be re-established. And re-establishing order required renewing the king's connection to the divine powers that legitimized his rule. And it would explain why the ritual was sexual. Not because sex was considered sacred in some vague sense, but because sexual union was understood as the most direct form of connection between two beings. A physical merging, a moment where boundaries dissolve and something passes from one body to another. In the sacred marriage, what passed was power, the emi of kingship, the authority to rule, to make decisions, to organize the city, to command armies, to oversee agriculture, to maintain the temples, to keep the gods present. All of it transferred in a single ritual moment through physical union from the goddess to the king. This is one of the darkest elements of Sumerian religion when viewed through modern eyes. Because if the ritual was understood as functional, not symbolic, then the high priestess wasn't participating voluntarily in the sense we'd recognize. She was performing a duty, a sacred obligation. Her body was being used as a vehicle for divine power transfer, and she had no choice in the matter because the entire social order depended on the ritual being performed correctly. Scholars debate how, literally, the sexual element was enacted. Some argue it was purely symbolic, a ritual enactment that didn't involve actual intercourse. Others point to the explicit language in the texts and argue that the ritual was performed literally. We don't have enough evidence to know for certain, but what we do know is that the Sumerians treated the sacred marriage as essential. It appears in texts from multiple cities across centuries. It's connected to kingship in ways that suggest it wasn't optional, and it's described as a power transfer, not merely a ceremonial blessing, which means that at the highest levels of Sumerian society, maintaining the connection to the Anunnaki required ceremonies that modern sensibilities would find deeply troubling. The sacred marriage was one, the death pit burials were another, and there were others. Some of those ceremonies required substitution, the sacrifice of one life to preserve another, the transfer of fate from the king to a replacement, and the ritual execution of that replacement to fulfill the cosmic bargain. These weren't peripheral practices. They were central to how the Sumerians maintained the order of their world, and understanding them requires confronting the possibility that what we call religion and what we call power weren't separate categories for the Sumerians. They were the same thing. Power was divine. Accessing it required ritual, and ritual sometimes required blood when the king must die. In 670 BC, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon received troubling news from his astrologers. They'd observed a lunar eclipse, and according to the omen texts, ancient catalogues of celestial events and their terrestrial meanings, a lunar eclipse during the king's watch portended disaster. Specifically, it predicted the king's death. Esarhaddon did not want to die. So his priests performed a ritual called Arpai, the substitute king ritual. The procedure is documented in multiple Neo-Assyrian tablets, primarily from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The tablets contain both the ritual instructions and correspondence from priests to the king discussing when and how the ritual should be performed. The basic structure is this. When omens predict the king's death, a substitute is chosen. The substitute is dressed as the king. He's crowned. He's enthroned. For a short period, anywhere from a few days to 100 days, depending on the specific omen and astrological calculations, the substitute functions as king. He sits on the throne. He wears the crown. He's addressed with royal titles. Meanwhile, the real king goes into hiding. He adopts a false name. He lives in seclusion. For the duration of the ritual, he is not the king. The substitute is. And then, at the end of the prescribed period, the substitute is killed, sometimes alongside a woman designated as the substitute queen. The deaths fulfill the omen. The predicted fate, the king's death, happens. But it happens to the substitute, not to the real king. After the substitute's execution, the real king emerges from hiding, reassumes his throne, and the crisis is over. The omen has been satisfied. The cosmic threat has been averted, and the king survives. This isn't legend, it actually happened. We have the correspondence, letters from priests to Esarhaddon discussing the details. The substitute king and the substitute queen have been taken to their fate. The king may now return to the palace. The evil of the omen has passed. Another letter, discussing an earlier instance of the ritual, mentions the substitute by name, a gardener called Dumki. After his execution, his body was given a royal burial. He was entombed with honours, and offerings were made for his spirit. The text treats him as if he had genuinely been king, even though everyone involved knew he was a substitute. The Arpai ritual is usually interpreted as apotropaic magic, evil-averting ritual designed to trick fate. The cosmos predicted the king's death. The ritual provides a king for the cosmos to kill. The prediction is fulfilled, but not in the way that actually harms the kingdom. It's clever, pragmatic, ruthless, but ultimately it's just a ritual. It doesn't really accomplish anything except convince the king he's safe. But that interpretation doesn't quite fit the evidence. First, the ritual is expensive and complex. It requires coordination across the entire palace infrastructure. The substitute must be installed convincingly. Court must be held with the substitute on the throne. Officials must interact with him as if he's truly the king. All of this while keeping the real king hidden and maintaining absolute secrecy about the substitution. Why go to that much trouble for a psychological trick? If the goal is just to make the king feel better, there are simpler ways to accomplish that. Second, the ritual is ancient. References to substitute king practices appear in texts going back to the Old Babylonian period, roughly 1600 BCE, and similar concepts appear even earlier in Sumerian literature. The practice of substitution, of transferring fate from one person to another through ritual, is deeply embedded in Mesopotamian religion. Third, the ritual is precise. The substitute must be chosen according to specific criteria. The timing must align with astrological calculations. Specific offerings must be made. Specific words must be spoken. And the substitute's death must occur in a particular way at a particular time to fulfill the omen correctly. If it's just theatre, why does the precision matter? One possibility, the ritual was understood as more than apotropaic magic. It was understood as cosmic contract fulfillment. In Mesopotamian theology, omens aren't random. They're communications from the gods. When a lunar eclipse occurs during the king's watch, and the omen texts say that predicts the king's death, that's not a guess about the future. It's a statement of divine intention. The gods have decreed the king's death. The omen is the announcement of that decree. Once decreed, the fate must be fulfilled. The cosmos operates according to divine law, and divine law must be satisfied. The king must die. The Arpai ritual doesn't avert that decree. it fulfills it. But it fulfills it through substitution. The ritual transfers the king's fate, his decreed death, to another person. That person assumes the king's identity through the ritual. And when that person dies, the decree is satisfied. The king died, just as predicted, but the king who died was the substitute, not the true king. In this reading, the ritual isn't trickery, it's a legal procedure, a way of satisfying cosmic law while preserving the function of kingship. The gods demand a king's death. The ritual provides a king's death. The debt is paid. But that raises a disturbing implication. If the ritual actually accomplishes this, if it actually transfers fate from one person to another, then it's not merely symbolic, it's functional, and it requires a human sacrifice to function. The substitute isn't a volunteer. The texts don't describe people lining up for the honour of dying in place of the king. The substitute is chosen, installed, and executed. He's a sacrifice in the most literal sense. His death serves a purpose. It fulfills a cosmic obligation. And from the perspective of the kingdom, it's necessary. This same logic appears in other Sumerian and Akkadian rituals. The scapegoat ritual, where sins or impurities are transferred to an animal that's then driven out or killed, operates on the principle of substitution. The substitute bears what would otherwise fall on the community. The community is purified through the substitute's death. The death pit burials at Ur could be understood in similar terms. The attendants aren't just servants, they're substitutes. Their deaths fulfill obligations that would otherwise fall on the community. They maintain connections that would otherwise sever. They preserve functions that would otherwise cease. And the sacred marriage, where the high priestess's body serves as a vessel for divine power transfer, operates on the same principle. One person serves as a conduit so that power can flow from the divine realm to the human realm. The individual's will is subsumed to the ritual's function. All of these practices share a common thread. The individual exists to serve the system. Personal agency, personal choice, personal life, all are subordinate to the cosmic order that the rituals maintain, and that order is identified with the will of the Anunnaki. This is the dark heart of what the Sumerian texts describe. The ceremonies performed to maintain Anunnaki power weren't benevolent acts of devotion. They were operations within a system where humans served specific functions, where human lives could be spent to maintain divine connections, where power flowed from gods to kings to priests to people, and maintaining that flow required procedures that consumed everything in their path. The texts don't apologize for this. They don't moralize about it. They simply describe it. This is how the system works. This is what's required. These are the ceremonies. These are the costs. And the texts were written by the beneficiaries of the system, the kings, the priests, the administrators who held power because the rituals gave them power. From their perspective, the system worked. The cities prospered, the temples stood, the gods remained present. The rituals accomplished what they were designed to accomplish. But from the perspective of the substitute king, or the death pit attendant, or the high priestess, the system demanded everything. And what it demanded was given, not because people wanted to give it, but because refusing would collapse the entire structure. And if the structure collapsed, everyone suffered. Unless there was another way. Unless the rituals weren't the only mechanism for maintaining civilization. Unless the Sumerians had become trapped in a system that convinced them divine power required human cost, when in fact the divine power was human all along. But that possibility isn't one the texts explore. The texts assume the Anunnaki are real. The texts assume their power is necessary. The texts assume the rituals work. And if the rituals worked, if they actually accomplished what the Sumerians believed they accomplished, then understanding those rituals means confronting a reality most modern people prefer to avoid, that power has always required sacrifice, that civilization has always been built on hidden costs, and that what we call progress has often been purchased with the lives of people whose names we'll never know. The priesthood's hidden knowledge. The Aduba tablet house was where Sumerian scribes were trained. Excavations at Nippur, and other sites have uncovered buildings identified as scribal schools based on the large numbers of practice tablets found there. These tablets contain repetitive exercises, writing the same cuneiform signs over and over, copying lexical lists, practicing mathematical problems, reproducing model compositions. Training to be a scribe took years. Students entered the Aduba as children and studied through adolescence. They learned to read and write Sumerian and Akkadian, to perform complex calculations, to keep administrative records, and to copy literary and religious texts. But not all scribes received the same education. Specialized training was reserved for those destined for temple service. Temple scribes weren't just copyists, they were ritual specialists. They needed to know not just how to read the ritual texts, but how to perform the rituals those texts described. And that knowledge was restricted. It wasn't written down in detail. It was transmitted orally, teacher to student, within the confines of the temple complex. This explains one of the puzzles of Sumerian ritual texts. The tablets we have are often incomplete or ambiguous. They describe steps in a ceremony but leave out crucial details. They reference materials without specifying quantities. They mention words that must be spoken without always recording those words. They assume the reader already knows the context. This isn't carelessness, it's intentional. The texts aren't meant to be self-contained instruction manuals. They're meant to be memory aids for people who've already been trained in the procedures. They're scripts, not operating manuals. The actual knowledge, the knowledge of how to perform the rituals correctly, was held in the memories and practices of the trained priests, and that knowledge was guarded. Temple priesthoods were hereditary. Priests trained their own children. Knowledge passed from father to son, mother to daughter, within priestly families. Outsiders could join the priesthood, but only through adoption into those families and years of apprenticeship under supervision. Why the secrecy? The standard explanation is social control. Specialized knowledge creates and maintains hierarchies. If only priests know how to perform the rituals, then priests are indispensable. Their power is secure. They can extract resources from the community by positioning themselves as necessary intermediaries between people and gods. But there's another possibility. The knowledge was restricted because it was dangerous. Not dangerous in a supernatural sense, necessarily. Dangerous in a practical sense. If the rituals actually accomplished something, if they created effects that required specific procedures to control, then allowing untrained people to attempt those rituals would be reckless, like giving a child a sharp knife. The tool itself isn't evil, but in the wrong hands it causes harm. This interpretation is supported by the structure of temple hierarchies. Sumerian temples had multiple levels of priests, each with different roles and different levels of access to restricted knowledge. At the top were the Ensi or En, the high priest or priestess, often the ruler of the city or a close relative. Below them were specialized priests, the Sangha, Ru, the Aipuhu, the Bru, the Kalau, the Mamau, and others. Each category had specific training and specific responsibilities. The Aipu performed purification rituals and exorcisms. The Bur interpreted omens. The Cow performed lamentations, specialized songs that appeased angry gods or mourned destroyed temples. The Mamau recited incantations for healing, protection, and cursing. And each category of priest had access to specific texts and specific procedures that other categories didn't. The Aipu's training included knowledge of the Mespi ritual, how to consecrate divine statues, but not every priest learned that. It was restricted to those specialists. Similarly, the Breurs training included the interpretation of extispacy, reading omens from animal entrails. This wasn't general knowledge. It required years of training, mastery of extensive omen catalogues, and the ability to recognise patterns in liver, lung, and intestine formations. The procedure was documented in tablets, but the tablets assume extensive prior training. They're reference works, not introductions. CBS 8241, the Neo-Sumerian ritual tablet from Nippur now in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, is a good example. The tablet describes a ritual procedure, but it doesn't explain why the ritual works, or what the underlying principles are. It simply lists steps. Do this, then this, then this. If done correctly, this result occurs. Someone reading that tablet without prior training would know the sequence of actions, but wouldn't understand the context. They wouldn't know which materials could be substituted and which couldn't. They wouldn't know how to recognise if the ritual was working. They wouldn't know what to do if something went wrong. The knowledge of those details was oral, experiential, transmitted through apprenticeship, and it was carefully restricted to initiates who'd proven themselves trustworthy and capable. This system of restricted knowledge transmission is consistent with priesthoods across ancient civilizations. Egyptian priests guarded the mysteries of their temples. Greek mystery religions initiated members through secret ceremonies that couldn't be described to outsiders. Jewish priests maintained the knowledge of temple service within the Levitical priesthood. Early Christian communities restricted the Eucharist to the baptized and kept certain teachings for advanced initiates. The pattern is universal, sacred knowledge is restricted. Why? One answer is that restriction creates value. Scarcity makes knowledge precious. But there's another answer. Some knowledge requires preparation. Not everyone is ready to handle it. Not everyone can be trusted with it. And teaching it prematurely or carelessly creates problems. For the Sumerians, the knowledge guarded by the priesthood was procedural knowledge. How to perform rituals that maintained the presence of the gods. How to transfer power from divine realm to human realm, how to avert cosmic threats through substitution, how to consecrate objects and spaces, how to interpret omens and respond appropriately, how to maintain the channels between the world of the Anunnaki and the world of humans. If those procedures actually accomplish something, if they were functional rather than purely symbolic, then restricting access makes sense. You don't want untrained people attempting complex operations they don't understand. You don't want them invoking forces they can't control. You don't want them disrupting systems that the entire civilization depends on. And you certainly don't want them learning the procedures and then using them for purposes the system wasn't designed for. Using power transfer rituals to legitimize illegitimate rulers. Using substitute king procedures to eliminate rivals. Using consecration rituals to create false divine presences, all of which becomes possible if the knowledge becomes public, if anyone can read the texts and attempt the procedures, if the safeguards of restricted transmission are removed. This raises a question about our own time. We now have access to these texts. Thousands of Sumerian tablets have been translated and published. They're available online. Anyone can read them. Anyone can study the procedures they describe. Does that mean anyone can perform them? The obvious answer is no, because the procedures don't actually work. They're ancient superstitions preserved for historical interest, but no longer functional, if they ever were. But suppose the procedures do work. Not in the literal sense the Sumerians described, statues coming to life, gods incarnating in temples, but in some other sense. Suppose the rituals create psychological effects, or social effects, or even subtle physical effects that we don't yet understand. Suppose they accomplish something real, even if we don't know how or why. Then publishing the texts without the oral transmission, without the training, without the safeguards, is like publishing bomb-making instructions without explaining what bombs do or why making them carelessly is dangerous. The information is available, but the wisdom to use it isn't. The Sumerian priests understood this. The knowledge they guarded wasn't just procedural, it was ethical. It included not just how to perform rituals, but when to perform them. Not just what the rituals accomplished, but what costs they demanded. Not just the mechanics, but the responsibility. And that ethical dimension was transmitted through apprenticeship, by living with a teacher, by observing not just the rituals, but the life of the ritualist, by absorbing not just the procedures, but the mindset, the discipline, the discernment. Modern scholars tend to dismiss this as mystification, as priesthoods protecting their privileges by pretending their knowledge is deeper than it actually is. And certainly, that's part of what happened. Power structures always protect themselves. But it's worth considering the alternative, that the knowledge really was deeper than the written texts convey, that the Sumerian priests understood things about ritual, power and consciousness that we've forgotten, that the reason the texts are incomplete isn't to protect priestly power, but to protect everyone from the consequences of performing procedures without understanding their full implications. If that's true, then the temples weren't just ceremonial spaces, they were laboratories, training grounds, workshops where specialists developed and maintained technologies that looked like religion but functioned like something else. Technologies for shaping consciousness, organising society, and maintaining contact with realities that most people never directly experienced. Technologies housed in structures built according to specific architectural principles, structures aligned with celestial bodies, structures designed not just to impress visitors, but to accomplish something functional, structures that the Sumerians called houses of the gods, temples as power stations. The ziggurat at Ur is one of the best preserved examples of Sumerian temple architecture. Built around 2100 B by King Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur, the structure was a massive stepped pyramid with a temple at its summit. The base measured approximately 210 by 150 feet, and the structure originally stood around 100 feet tall, though only the lowest levels survive today. The ziggurat wasn't a solid mass. It was constructed as a series of platforms, each smaller than the one below, connected by monumental staircases. The core was mud brick, faced with baked brick, set in bitumen. The baked bricks provided structural integrity and weather resistance. The bitumen, natural petroleum tar, waterproofed the structure, but the design included features that went beyond simple structural necessity. The corners of the ziggurat were oriented to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, with remarkable precision. The alignment wasn't approximate. It was exact, suggesting the builders used astronomical observations to determine true north rather than relying on magnetic compasses, which didn't exist. The walls weren't vertical, they sloped inward slightly, and the slope was intentionally varied at different levels to create optical effects. When viewed from ground level, the ziggurat appeared even more massive than it actually was. The architects understood perspective and used it to enhance the structure's visual impact. Drainage channels were built into the structure, allowing rainwater to flow through the interior rather than accumulating and destabilizing the mud brick core. The channels were precisely engineered, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of hydrology, and the entire structure was built on a raised platform, elevating it above the surrounding city. The ziggurat was the highest point in Ur. It dominated the skyline. It was visible from miles away. It announced the presence of the god before visitors even entered the city. At the summit was the temple proper, a small building where the god's statue resided. This wasn't public space. Only priests entered the summit temple. The general population worshipped in lower courts and outer precincts. The ziggurat's height created separation. Physical elevation symbolized divine transcendence. To approach the god required ascent, labour, purification at each level. The temple hymns, a collection of 42 hymns describing temples across Sumer, provide literary descriptions of these structures. One hymn describes the temple of Enki at Eridu. O house of Enki, mountain rising out of the waters, you are founded in the Abzu, the great deep. Your prince is the great prince of the earth. Your king is the lord of vast intelligence. O Eridu, your shadow extends over the cultivated land. Your divine powers are unequalled. Another hymn describes the temple of Inanna at Uruk. O house, red like the midday heat of heaven, tall as the land, exalted like the land, beautifully decorated like the stars, drawing all people, you stand in the city like a great bull, your horns raised. These aren't abstract poetry. They're descriptions of physical structures. Red like midday heat, the baked bricks were reddish. Tall as the land, the ziggurats were the tallest structures the Sumerians built. Drawing all people, they served as gathering points, visible landmarks, centres of civic life. But the hymns also describe something else. They describe the temples as possessing divine powers, as being founded in the Abzu, as drawing people and standing like living entities. The language treats the buildings as more than architecture, as functional structures with purposes beyond housing statues. What purposes? One theory, developed by some archaeoastronomers, is that the ziggurats functioned as astronomical observatories. The elevated platforms provided clear views of the horizon. The precise alignment to cardinal directions would facilitate tracking celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, planetary positions, star risings, and Sumerian religion was deeply concerned with celestial phenomena. The gods were associated with planets and stars, omens were read from eclipses and conjunctions. The ritual calendar was based on lunar cycles. If the temples functioned as observatories, that would explain the architectural precision, the orientation, the elevation, the clear sight lines, all would serve observational purposes. The priests weren't just performing rituals, they were tracking the heavens, correlating celestial patterns with terrestrial events, and using that information to time rituals correctly. Another theory focuses on acoustics. Some researchers have noticed that certain temple structures have unusual acoustic properties. Sounds made in specific locations resonate or echo in unexpected ways. This could be accidental, a byproduct of the architecture, or it could be intentional. Sound was important in Sumerian ritual. Hymns were sung, prayers were chanted, lamentations were performed by specialized singers. If the architecture amplified or modulated those sounds in specific ways, that would enhance the ritual experience. A third theory, more speculative, suggests the temples functioned as energy conduits. This isn't energy in the scientific sense, electricity, magnetism, radiation. It's energy in the sense of subtle forces that ancient peoples might have perceived and worked with. The alignment of structures to celestial bodies, the use of specific materials, gold, lapis lazuli, cedar, the precise geometry, all of it creating conditions that focused or channeled some form of influence. This interpretation is difficult to evaluate because we don't have clear models for what that influence would be, but it's consistent with how the Sumerians described their temples. They didn't call them buildings, they called them houses, the house of Enki, the house of Inanna, the house of Ningirsu, and they treated them as living structures inhabited by conscious beings who saw through them, heard through them, and acted through them. If the temples were more than symbolic structures, if they were functional devices designed to maintain divine presence, then their architecture would matter. The materials would matter, the geometry would matter, the alignment would matter, not because of primitive superstition, but because the builders understood principles we've forgotten, principles about how to create structures that could serve as interfaces between human consciousness and something else, something the Sumerians called gods. This interpretation is speculative, but it's worth noting that temple architecture appears suddenly in the archaeological record, already sophisticated, already following specific patterns. The earliest temples at Eridu, dating to 5000 BC, already have the basic features that later ziggurats would elaborate: platform elevation, oriented layout, central sanctuary, offerings area. It's not gradual evolution from simple to complex. It's immediate implementation of a design that persists for thousands of years. Either the Sumerians independently invented effective temple architecture through trial and error very quickly, or they inherited a design that worked and replicated it. And if they inherited it from someone who understood what the design was meant to accomplish. The Gudea cylinders describe this exactly. Ningasu gives Gudea the temple plan in a vision. The design comes from the god, not from human creativity, and Gudea follows it precisely because deviating from divine specifications would result in a temple that didn't function correctly. Function for what? For housing the god, for maintaining divine presence, for serving as the connection point between the realm of the Anunnaki and the realm of humans, for channeling divine power into earthly structures so that power could be accessed through ritual procedures. If that function was real, even in some limited or misunderstood sense, then the temples were technologies, advanced technologies, not machines in the mechanical sense, but systems designed according to principles that integrated architecture, astronomy, acoustics, ritual procedure, and human consciousness into a unified whole. And those systems required maintenance, daily offerings, regular rituals, constant attention from trained specialists who knew how to keep the systems running. The priests weren't performing empty ceremonies. They were operating a technology that their civilization depended on, unless they weren't. Unless the whole thing was an elaborate illusion maintained for centuries by people who convinced themselves it mattered, when in fact it didn't. When in fact the temples were just buildings, the rituals were just customs, and the gods were just stories people told to make sense of a world they didn't understand. That's the mainstream view, and it might be correct, but it's worth asking, if the Sumerians were deluded, if their entire religious system was built on illusions, why did it work so well? Why did their cities flourish for thousands of years? Why did their mathematical and astronomical knowledge surpass most later civilizations? Why did their legal systems, their literature, their administrative structures become models for every subsequent Mesopotamian culture? Delusional societies don't typically function that effectively for that long. Societies built on false premises tend to collapse when those premises prove inadequate. But Sumerian civilization didn't collapse because its religious system failed. It collapsed because it was conquered, first by the Akkadians, then by the Amorites, then by others. But the temples continued, the rituals continued, the same procedures, in the same buildings, for the same gods. Because whatever those procedures accomplished, they accomplished it effectively enough that conquest didn't stop them. The conquerors adopted the system, learnt the rituals, continued the maintenance, generation after generation, millennium after millennium, until finally, in the early centuries of the Common Era, the temples were abandoned. Christianity and Islam spread through the region. The old gods were forgotten. The ziggurats crumbled. The knowledge of how to perform the rituals was lost, and we're left with the texts, thousands of tablets describing ceremonies we can read but no longer fully understand, procedures we can translate but can't evaluate because we don't know what they were supposed to accomplish, except for one thing. We know what the Sumerians said those procedures cost, and what they cost was everything. The price of divine favour. Temple economics are well documented in Sumerian administrative texts. Thousands of tablets from sites like Nippur, Lagash and Uruk record daily transactions, receipts for grain, tallies of livestock, assignments of labour, distributions of goods, allocations of land. These weren't ceremonial records. They were actual accounting. The temples functioned as economic centres, managing resources on a massive scale. A tablet from the archives of the 3rd dynasty of Ur records offerings made to the goddess Inanna at Uruk over the course of a single month. The list includes 54 sheep, 25 lambs, 2 cows, 90 containers of bread, 40 containers of beer, quantities of dates, butter, cheese, and grain. This is 1 month at one temple for one goddess. Multiplied across dozens of temples in dozens of cities, the economic investment in maintaining divine presence was staggering. A significant portion of Sumer's agricultural output went directly to temple offering. Workers were assigned to temple service, bakers making bread for the gods, brewers making beer for the gods, shepherds raising animals for the gods, farmers growing grain for the gods. The standard interpretation is that this system functioned as wealth redistribution. The temples collected offerings from the population, then redistributed that wealth as payment to temple workers, loans to farmers, support for widows and orphans. The religious framing legitimised what was essentially a proto-taxation system. And that's partly true. Temples did function as economic redistributors. But the texts don't describe offerings as taxes. They describe them as food for the gods, literal food, consumed by the gods' statues, required daily to maintain divine presence. The ritual of feeding the gods was elaborate. Each morning, priests entered the inner sanctuary where the divine statue resided. They awakened the god with hymns. They offered water for the god to wash. They dressed the god in fresh garments. Then they placed food before the statue, bread, meat, beer, dates, milk, and recited prayers inviting the god to eat. The statue didn't physically consume the food. It remained on the offering table. After a prescribed period, the priests removed the offerings and redistributed them to other deities in the temple complex, then to the priests themselves, then sometimes to the general population during festivals. But the ritual treated the offerings as if they were consumed by the god. The texts describe the god as eating, drinking, and being satisfied. The quantity and quality of offerings mattered. Insufficient offerings angered the gods. Low-quality offerings were insulting. The gods required proper maintenance, and proper maintenance required resources. Where did those resources come from? From the agricultural labour of the Sumerian population, from the fields irrigated by systems the temples organised and maintained, from the tribute collected by kings who ruled by divine mandate, from the work of people who believed, or were required to believe, that maintaining the god's presence was necessary for the city's survival. And perhaps it was, not because the gods literally ate the food, but because the system created social cohesion, organised labour, maintained infrastructure, and provided a framework for collective action. The temples functioned because people believed they functioned, and their belief was reinforced by the visible prosperity of cities with active temples versus the visible collapse of cities whose temples were destroyed. But the cost wasn't just economic, it was human. We've already discussed the death pits at Ur, human sacrifice on a massive scale. We've discussed the substitute king ritual, human sacrifice disguised as royal substitution. We've discussed the sacred marriage, the use of human bodies as vessels for divine power transfer. But there were other costs embedded throughout the system. The temple workers, who spent their entire lives in service, not by choice, but by birth, into temple families. The children dedicated to temple service before they were old enough to consent. The slaves and captives assigned to temple labour. The women serving as sacred prostitutes, a role that the texts describe matter-of-factly, but that modern readers recognise as sexual exploitation. The system consumed lives. It demanded them, and it justified those demands by framing them as necessary for maintaining cosmic order. The gods required service. The temples required workers. The rituals required participants. And refusing to provide what the system required meant abandoning the gods, breaking the cosmic contract, and inviting catastrophe. This is the dark logic at the heart of Sumerian religion. Individuals don't matter, communities matter, the city matters, and the city survives only if the gods remain present. Therefore, anything that maintains divine presence is justified. Any cost is acceptable. Any sacrifice is necessary. Modern readers tend to judge this harshly. We value individual autonomy. We reject systems that treat people as expendable. We're horrified by human sacrifice, forced service, and sexual exploitation, regardless of the religious framing. But the Sumerians didn't share those values, or rather, they had a different priority hierarchy. Community survival was paramount, individual rights were secondary, and if maintaining community survival required practices we'd now consider atrocities, those practices were performed without apology, because from the Sumerian perspective, the alternative was worse. The alternative was the gods leaving, and when the gods left, cities fell. The archaeological and textual evidence is consistent on this. Cities whose temples were destroyed didn't recover. They declined. They were abandoned. The population dispersed. The irrigation systems fell into disrepair. The land reverted to desert. This pattern appears repeatedly. The destruction of Ur around 2000 BC is documented in The Lament for Ur, a long Sumerian poem describing the city's fall to Elamite invasion. The text explicitly states that the gods abandoned Ur before the destruction. The divine statues were removed. The temples were empty. And without divine protection, the city was defenseless. Whether the gods actually existed and actually protected the city is beside the point. The Sumerians believed they did, and their belief shaped their entire civilization. The temples, the rituals, the economics, the social structure, the legal system, the kingship, all of it was organized around maintaining divine presence, and the costs of maintaining that presence were considered reasonable because the consequences of failure were catastrophic. This is why the ceremonies described in Sumerian texts are so troubling. They weren't aberrations. They weren't deviations from an otherwise benign religious system. They were the system. The MSP rituals, the sacred marriages, the substitute king procedures, the death pit burials, all of them were expressions of the same underlying principle. Maintaining the connection to the Anunnaki requires sacrifice, and the Sumerians sacrificed for thousands of years with absolute consistency across multiple civilizations and multiple conquests, because they believed it worked, or perhaps because it did work in ways we can no longer verify or understand. And now we're left with the question, what were they actually doing? What were these ceremonies actually accomplishing? And what does it mean that they continued with such precision for so long at such cost? What the mainstream won't address. Mainstream Sumerian scholarship offers a clear framework for understanding these texts. The framework goes something like this. The Sumerians were an early civilization developing in southern Mesopotamia around 4500-3500 BCE. They invented writing, mathematics, monumental architecture, and complex urban societies. Their religion reflected their understanding of natural forces, social hierarchies, and existential questions. They personified those forces as gods, built temples to honour them, and performed rituals that reinforced social cohesion and political authority. The gods weren't real. The rituals didn't literally accomplish what the texts claim. The statues didn't come to life. The temples weren't houses of conscious divine beings. The death pit attendants didn't accompany their queen into a functional afterlife. The sacred marriage didn't transfer actual power. The substitute king ritual didn't avert cosmic fate. All of it was cultural construction, shared fiction, belief systems that served social and political functions but didn't correspond to objective reality. The Sumerians believed their religion was true, but they were mistaken. We know better now. We understand that gods are projections, rituals are psychological, and texts describe beliefs, not facts. This framework is intellectually defensible. It's consistent with naturalistic assumptions. It doesn't require accepting anything that can't be verified through material evidence. And it allows scholars to study Sumerian civilization without needing to evaluate supernatural claims. But the framework has problems. Problem 1, it doesn't explain the precision. If rituals are purely symbolic, if they accomplish nothing beyond psychological and social effects, why do the texts insist on such exact procedures? Why specify which type of wood, which celestial alignment, which words at which moments? Symbolic rituals can be effective without being precise, but Sumerian ritual texts read like engineering manuals, not religious poetry. Problem 2, it doesn't explain the consistency. Sumerian religious procedures were maintained across 3,000 years by multiple distinct civilizations: Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians. Each adopted the rituals of their predecessors and continued them with minimal alteration. That's remarkable cultural conservatism for systems that allegedly accomplished nothing real. Purely cultural constructs tend to evolve rapidly as societies change, but core Mesopotamian rituals remained stable for millennia. Problem 3, it doesn't explain the costs. If the rituals were symbolic, why were they so expensive? Why devote such enormous resources, economic, labour, human, to maintaining them? The death pit burials alone represent massive investment in ceremonies that mainstream scholarship treats as tragic delusions. But deluded societies don't typically function as effectively as Sumer did. There's a disconnect between the interpretation and the evidence. Problem 4, it dismisses the text's own claims without seriously evaluating them. The Sumerians said the rituals worked. They said the gods were present. They said the procedures accomplished specific effects. Mainstream scholarship says they were wrong and moves on. But that's circular reasoning. We know the gods weren't real because gods aren't real. We know the rituals didn't work because rituals don't work. The conclusion is embedded in the premises. But what if we suspend those premises temporarily? What if we take the text seriously on their own terms and ask, if the Sumerians were describing something real, what could it have been? 3 interpretations emerge. Interpretation 1, symbolic mythology. This is the mainstream view. The gods represent natural forces. Enlil is wind, Enki is water, Inanna is the planet Venus. The myths explain those forces through narrative. The rituals honour them through symbolic action. All of it is metaphor, meaning making through story. The Sumerians personified their world because that's how pre-scientific peoples understand causation. Modern people know better. This interpretation is coherent. But it requires viewing the Sumerians as fundamentally different from us, less rational, less capable of distinguishing reality from imagination, more prone to confusing symbol with substance. It's possible, but it's also somewhat condescending. Interpretation 2, encoded spiritual wisdom. This interpretation suggests the texts contain genuine insights, but not the ones they appear to describe. The gods aren't literal beings. They're symbols of psychological or spiritual realities. The Anunnaki represent aspects of consciousness. The rituals are technologies for altering consciousness, inducing trance states, accessing non-ordinary perception. In this reading, the Mes-P ritual doesn't animate a statue. It creates conditions where human consciousness projects life into the statue, then relates to that projection as if it's external. The sacred marriage doesn't transfer divine power. It induces psychological states in king and priestess that enhance confidence, authority, and social cohesion. The substitute king ritual doesn't avert fate. It resolves psychological conflict by externalizing the fear of death onto another person. This interpretation takes the texts more seriously than the symbolic view. It suggests the Sumerians understood something real about consciousness and developed procedures to work with it effectively. But it still treats the text's literal claims, gods existing, power transferring, fate averting, as misunderstandings or poetic language for subjective experiences. Interpretation 3. Preserved procedures from actual divine-human interaction. This interpretation takes the texts at face value. The Anunnaki were real beings who existed in some form, not necessarily supernatural in a religious sense, but real. They interacted with early humans. They taught procedures for maintaining contact. Those procedures were preserved through temple rituals, and the texts are records from the Sumerian perspective of what actually happened. This interpretation requires accepting either non-human intelligence exists and has interacted with humans, the Anunnaki were an earlier advanced human civilization now forgotten, or the texts describe experiences of non-ordinary reality that are genuine but difficult to categorize, not physical beings, not purely psychological projections, but something in between. This interpretation is the hardest for modern scholars to accept because it requires abandoning naturalistic assumptions. But it's worth noting that it's the interpretation the texts themselves support. The Sumerians didn't write as if they were describing myths or encoding wisdom. They wrote as if they were recording events, describing entities, and preserving procedures. If they were recording events, then the ceremonies described in the texts weren't attempts to invoke gods who weren't there. They were maintenance procedures for preserving connections to beings who had once been there but were no longer physically present. The rituals didn't create divine presence through belief. They maintained divine presence through correct procedure. And when the procedures stopped, the presence genuinely faded. This would explain the architectural precision of temples. They were built to specifications provided by beings who understood principles we've lost. It would explain the procedural precision of rituals. They were replicas of procedures originally demonstrated by the Anunnaki. It would explain the consistency across cultures. Everyone was preserving the same inherited system. And it would explain the costs. The system was understood as genuinely necessary for survival. It would also explain why the system eventually failed. If the rituals were maintaining connections that were already weakening, and if those connections depended on continuous human effort to preserve, then discontinuing the procedures would sever the connections permanently. When the temples were abandoned, when Christianity and Islam replaced the old religions, when the knowledge of the rituals was lost, the connection was broken. The Anunnaki didn't leave because they were never there, or they left because humans stopped performing the procedures that kept them anchored to our reality. This interpretation is speculative, but it has the virtue of taking the texts seriously instead of dismissing them, and it's consistent with patterns in other ancient civilizations. The Egyptian pyramid texts describe similar procedures: rituals for maintaining divine presence, ceremonies for transferring power, architectural specifications revealed by gods. The Vedic tradition preserves detailed ritual procedures that practitioners claim produce specific effects. Indigenous cultures worldwide maintain ceremonies they describe as necessary for maintaining cosmic balance, ceremonies taught by beings who came before. Either all of these traditions are independent delusions, or they're preserving memories of something that actually happened, something that ancient peoples interpreted through the categories available to them, gods, spirits, ancestors, but that might have been something else, something we don't yet have adequate categories for. The question isn't which interpretation is correct. We don't have enough evidence to know. The question is which interpretation is most consistent with the evidence we have. And that's a harder question than it appears, because the evidence includes not just the text, but the effects. The fact that Sumerian civilization functioned effectively for thousands of years. The fact that the rituals were maintained at enormous cost. The fact that cities with active temples prospered and cities whose temples were destroyed collapsed. The fact that multiple civilizations adopted the same system voluntarily. All of that suggests the system worked. at least in the sense that people who used it thought it worked, and their societies functioned better than societies without it. Whether it worked because the gods were real, or because the psychology was effective, or because the social organisation was superior, is a separate question. But something about the system was functional. And whatever that something was, the Sumerians built their entire civilization around it. Which brings us back to the ceremonies, the dark ceremonies, the ones that required blood and sacrifice, and the subordination of individual lives to cosmic necessity. Those ceremonies were part of the functional system. They weren't aberrations. They were core elements. And if we want to understand what the system was actually doing, we can't ignore them. We have to confront them. Ask what they accomplished. Ask why they were considered necessary. Ask what would have happened if they hadn't been performed. The texts suggest an answer, but it's not an answer most modern people want to hear. The weight of ancient words. The Louvre's curators rotate the Gudea cylinders periodically. They're not always on display. Sometimes they're in storage, protected from light and atmospheric fluctuations that could damage them over time. But when they are displayed, they sit in glass cases in the Mesopotamian Antiquities section, surrounded by other artifacts from ancient Sumer, statues, seals, tablets, fragments of temple walls. The cylinders are unremarkable to most visitors. They're brown clay tubes covered in small wedge-shaped marks. Without context, they look like ancient administrative documents, accounting records maybe, tax receipts, the kind of thing museums collect but nobody looks at. But if you read the translations, if you understand what the marks actually say, the cylinders become something else. They become evidence of a worldview so foreign to our own that it's difficult to comprehend, evidence of procedures we can read but no longer perform, evidence of a relationship between humans and something else, something the Sumerians called gods, that our civilization has forgotten how to maintain, or evidence that no such relationship ever existed, that the Sumerians were writing about delusions, that the cylinders document nothing more than one king's elaborate self-justification for spending enormous resources on a building project. That the whole thing, the dream, the divine instruction, the temple construction, the god taking up residence, was theatre, political propaganda, religious fiction. We can't know which interpretation is correct. The evidence is ambiguous. The texts say one thing, naturalistic assumptions say another, and we're left in between, trying to make sense of records from a civilization that no longer exists, describing experiences we can't verify, preserving procedures we can't replicate. What we can say is this: the Sumerians took their relationship with the Anunnaki seriously, deadly seriously, literally. They built temples according to divine specifications. They performed rituals with absolute precision. They maintained those procedures across thousands of years at enormous cost. They sacrificed wealth, labour, and sometimes human lives to preserve the system. And from their perspective, it worked. Their cities flourished. Their agriculture sustained large populations. Their mathematics and astronomy advanced. Their legal systems brought order. Their literature explored profound questions. Their civilization lasted longer and accomplished more than most civilizations before or since. Was their success because of the rituals, or in spite of them? Did maintaining the presence of the Anunnaki through elaborate ceremonies actually accomplish something, or did it just create sufficient social cohesion and organization to support complex civilization? Were the gods real, or were they the most effective fiction humans ever invented for organizing collective action? The texts don't answer that question. They assume the gods are real. They describe procedures for maintaining divine presence as matter-of-factly as a modern manual describes maintaining a machine. They record costs, animal sacrifices, human sacrifices, economic investment, lifelong service, without apology or explanation. Those costs was simply what the system required. And the question we're left with is, what system were they actually maintaining? What was actually happening in those temples? What did the priests actually experience when they performed the MSP ritual and believed the statue had come to life? What did the king and priestess actually feel during the sacred marriage? What did the substitute king understand about his fate as he sat on the throne, wearing the crown, knowing he would be killed to satisfy an omen? We don't know. We can speculate. We can offer psychological explanations, sociological explanations, naturalistic explanations, but we can't know what it was like to live inside that worldview, to genuinely believe that the gods existed, that they required service, that civilization depended on maintaining their presence through precise ritual procedures. And perhaps that's the most important thing these texts preserve. Not answers, but questions. Questions about power, where it comes from, how it's maintained, what it costs. Questions about the relationship between belief and reality, whether what we believe shapes what we experience, or whether what we experience shapes what we believe. Questions about civilization, what holds it together, what makes it function, what causes it to collapse. The Sumerians built their civilization on the assumption that divine power was real, that it could be accessed through ritual, and that accessing it required sacrifice. They built temples to house gods, they trained priests to maintain divine presence, they performed ceremonies that transferred power from divine realm to human realm. They did this for 3,000 years with absolute consistency. Either they were maintaining something real, or they were maintaining the most successful illusion in human history. Either the Anunnaki existed in some form, and the rituals kept them connected to human civilization, or the Anunnaki never existed, and the rituals created social structures so effective that they functioned as if the gods were real. Both interpretations lead to the same conclusion: the ceremonies worked, not necessarily in the way the texts describe, but they accomplished something. They created effects. They shaped civilization. They channeled human effort in directions that built cities, organised populations, created art and literature and mathematics and astronomy, and those accomplishments came at a price. The price was recorded in the texts, preserved in the archaeological record, and visible in the mass graves at Ur. The price was human. Individual lives subordinated to collective necessity, personal freedom sacrificed to cosmic order, bodies used as vessels, as substitutes, as offerings, as tools for maintaining a system that demanded everything and gave power only to those who served it. This is the dark heart of Sumerian religion, and it's a darkness we haven't escaped, because every civilization since has made similar bargains, different gods, different rituals, different justifications, but the same underlying structure. Power requires sacrifice, civilization requires power, and the sacrifices are borne by those who have no choice. The Gudea cylinders sit in their glass case, silent, inert, unreadable to anyone who hasn't studied cuneiform, but the words they contain are still there. Instructions for building a temple, instructions for maintaining divine presence, instructions for performing ceremonies that the Sumerians believed kept their world from collapsing into chaos. Whether those instructions were received from gods or invented by humans, whether they describe reality or create it, whether they should be understood as history or mythology, those questions remain open. The texts don't resolve them, scholarship doesn't resolve them, belief doesn't resolve them. What remains is the evidence. Thousands of tablets, hundreds of temples, dozens of cities, millions of lives organised around maintaining contact with something the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. Contact that required precision, demanded sacrifice, and shaped the course of human civilization. And the question that won't go away: what if they were right? Not right in every detail, not right in the literal interpretation of every claim, but right in the fundamental insight that power exists beyond human origin, that accessing it requires more than force or intelligence, that it demands relationship maintained through procedure, and that the cost of maintaining that relationship is the price of civilization itself. That's what the texts suggest. That's what the ceremonies enacted. That's what the Sumerians believed with enough conviction to sustain their civilization for 3 millennia. We can dismiss them as primitive. We can explain them away as pre-scientific. We can reduce their entire worldview to psychology, sociology, political economy. But we can't erase the fact that their system worked, that their temples stood, that their texts survived, that their procedures were preserved with such care that we can still read them 4,000 years later. And we can't escape the uncomfortable possibility that they knew something we've forgotten, something about power, something about consciousness, something about the relationship between human will and cosmic order, something they encoded in rituals we call dark only because we no longer understand what they were meant to accomplish. The weight of those ancient words presses down through the centuries, not as answered questions, as questions that won't stop being asked, questions about who we are, where power comes from, what civilization costs, and what we're willing to sacrifice to maintain it. The Sumerians gave their answer. They built temples, they performed ceremonies, they sacrificed what the system demanded, and they recorded it all in wedges pressed into clay, baked hard, buried beneath their cities, waiting for archaeologists to dig them up, and translators to read them, and people like you, lying in bed late at night, or driving through traffic, or sitting in quiet rooms, to wonder what it all meant. The texts don't provide closure, they provide evidence. What we do with that evidence, how we interpret it, what conclusions we draw, what questions we let it raise, that's up to us. But the ceremonies were real, the costs were real, the power was real, at least in the sense that people who possessed it could shape civilizations, and people who lacked it were consumed by the system. And the texts remain, preserved with care, describing procedures that sound like madness until you realise they worked. However we explain them, whatever we believe about them, however much we distance ourselves from the worldview that created them, they worked. And perhaps that's the most unsettling possibility of all.